Your tactics are garbage. According to the internet, that's what happens when the New Zealand Special Air Service looks at the American way of war. A flinty Kiwi sergeant delivering the verdict to a room full of US Navy SEALs who fall silent, humbled, schooled. It's a scene with everything. Elite egos, national pride, a satisfying punchline. There's only one problem, and if you've followed this channel, you already know what's coming. Nobody can produce the sergeant. No book, no interview, no named soldier on either side. The quote is Folklore, one more entry in the internet's growing library of invented special forces, smackdowns, the same factory that manufactures sneering captains, humiliated instructors, and anonymous admissions of inferiority, and staples them to whichever elite unit the algorithm is feeding on this week. So why make this video at all? Because underneath the fake quote sits a completely real argument, maybe the deepest doctrinal divide in the entire special operations world. The US Navy SEALs and the New Zealand Special Air Service genuinely do represent two opposed answers to the same question. What is the best way for a small group of elite soldiers to fight? One answer is speed, firepower, technology, and violence of action. The other is silence, patience, fieldcraft, and never being seen at all. Loud versus invisible. Both communities would phrase it more politely than the title does. Neither would deny the divide exists. And here's what makes this story more than a theory debate. In March 2002, in the freezing peaks of Afghanistan's Hindu Kush, a single battle put both philosophies on the same mountains in the same week against the same enemy, and graded them in blood. Operation Anaconda would become the largest set-piece battle of the early Afghan war. Hidden inside it are two smaller stories. Coalition reconnaissance patrols, including 3 from the New Zealand Special Air Service, lying silent and unseen in the enemy's own hills, and, on one terrible peak called Takur Ghar, the highest profile direct action insertion of the campaign meeting. The one thing no helicopter can outfly: a wrong assumption. Let's be precise about what this story is not. It is not a story about American incompetence. You'll hear about American reconnaissance done brilliantly, and about courage on Takur Ghar that produced 2 medals of honor. It is not a story about Kiwi superiority. The New Zealanders' way has costs and limits of its own, and they'd be the first to say so. It's the story the fake quote is gesturing at and getting wrong. 2 elite tribes, each carrying a century of institutional instinct, discovering in the hardest terrain on Earth exactly where each other's philosophies begin and end. By the end, you'll understand why the argument exists, what the mountain decided, and why, 20 years on, the 2 units that supposedly despise each other's tactics keep training together anyway. One more thing before we climb. Everything of substance in this script is anchored to the public record. The official histories of Task Force K-Bar, the documented reconnaissance screen of Operation Anaconda, the after-action record of Takur Ghar, the citations that followed. Where this story describes doctrine, it describes what each community openly teaches and preaches about itself. What you will not hear is invented dialogue. The 2 tribes did their arguing through operations, and the operations are all on the record. First, meet the loud tribe properly, because the SEAL way of war didn't come from arrogance. It came from the sea and from a very specific, very American theory of violence. Every military doctrine is a fossil record of the battles that formed it. To understand why SEALs fight the way they fight, look at where they were born. Their ancestors were the Naval Combat Demolition Units and underwater demolition teams of the Second World War. Swimmers who went in ahead of the landings at Normandy and across the Pacific to blow the beach obstacles. Men whose survival depended on getting in and out before the shore batteries understood what was happening. Vietnam added the Riverine War. SEAL platoons ambushing from the swamps of the Mekong Delta, arriving by boat and helicopter, hitting hard, gone in minutes. The Cold War added shipboarding, oil platforms, hostage rescue, the whole modern grammar of the raid. Frogmen, by definition, arrive from the water, do something violent and precise, and leave before the enemy can organize a response. Speed is survival. Surprise is armor. Firepower is the eraser that fixes mistakes. Out of that lineage came the modern SEAL doctrine of direct action and its beating heart, violence of action. The phrase has a specific meaning. It holds that overwhelming aggression, applied faster than the enemy can think, is itself a form of protection. That the assault force, which moves loudest and hits hardest, actually takes fewer casualties because the enemy never recovers from the first second of contact. Everything in the American system feeds this idea. Helicopters deliver you to the objective in minutes. Night vision owns the darkness. Air support stacks overhead like a deck of loaded guns. Intelligence arrives from drones, satellites, and intercepts. The SEAL operator sits at the tip of a $1 trillion spear, and the doctrine assumes the spear. And feeding the doctrine stands the most complete support machine ever built for soldiers. A selection pipeline famous for breaking most of the men who attempt it. Then years of specialized schooling. Then equipment budgets larger than some Allied defense forces. Then the guarantee that when a SEAL element gets into trouble, the response, gunships, jets, quick reaction forces, surgical teams, is measured in minutes. Abundance isn't a luxury in this doctrine. It is a load-bearing wall. Be honest about this. The doctrine works. It has worked on 1,000 nights of raids, rescues, and interventions. When the target is fixed, the intelligence is good, and the clock is short, a hostage, a fleeting terrorist leader, a ship taken by pirates. Nothing on earth matches it. If your family were held in a compound, you would want the loud tribe coming, and you would want them coming fast. But every doctrine carries hidden assumptions, and assumptions are where doctrines die. Direct action assumes you know where the enemy is, that intelligence has done its work before the helicopters lift. It assumes the machine arrives intact, that the landing zone is what the planners believe it is. And it assumes the environment is passable terrain rather than an enemy in its own right. Strip those assumptions away, put the operator somewhere the drones misread, at altitudes that gut helicopter performance, against an enemy who has been dug into the rocks for months. And the loudest doctrine on earth suddenly has a very quiet problem. In the winter of 2001 to 2002, the war in Afghanistan was migrating toward exactly that trap. Al-Qaeda's survivors were leaving the roads and cities and climbing into the Shahi Kot Valley of the Hindu Kush, a fortress of ridgelines above 3,000 meters, honeycombed with caves and gun positions, in temperatures that killed machines and men impartially. Somebody would have to find them the old way, and in the American-led coalition of that winter, Task Force K-Bar, a multinational stable of special operations units under a U.S. Navy SEAL captain, there happened to be soldiers whose entire national doctrine was built for precisely this job. They came from the bottom of the world, and their way of war was born not on beaches, but in jungles, where the loudest thing a soldier ever did was breathe. The New Zealand Special Air Service learned war in places where firepower was almost useless, and being seen was death. Formed in 1955, the regiment cut its teeth in the jungles of Malaya, then Borneo, then Vietnam, where New Zealand troopers patrolled inside Australian SAS squadrons out of Nui Dat, hunting an enemy who owned the terrain, outnumbered them absurdly, and could not be outgunned, only outcrafted. Jungle war rewrote every instinct. Helicopters told the enemy you were coming. Gunfire told him where you were. Resupply told him where you'd be tomorrow. So the regiment built its doctrine around the only advantages available to a small, poor, patient force. Move slowly, leave nothing, see first, and treat invisibility not as a tactic, but as a state of being. Where the SEAL doctrine says speed is survival, the New Zealand doctrine says signature is death. And signature means everything detectable: sound, light, track, scent, radio, rhythm. Kill your signature and the enemy is fighting a ghost. The skills that support this are almost pre-industrial. Tracking, reading ground, the way scholars read manuscripts, a bruised leaf, a rolled pebble, the age of a boot print by how its edges have dried. Counter-tracking, camouflage as a full-time discipline, navigation without emissions, the patience to lie in a hide for days, urinating into bottles, moving centimeters per hour, while an enemy walks close enough to hear him complain about his feet. New Zealand soldiers train these skills in some of the harshest schoolrooms on earth. The regiment's selection and bush phases are notorious even among Allied special forces. And the standard isn't proficiency, it's instinct. The trooper who checks the wind before he checks his weapon, who reads a hillside for dead ground the way a taxi driver reads traffic, who treats every emission, from a boot print to a radio click, as a debt the enemy will eventually collect. And where the American doctrine assumes the spear, the overwhelming machine behind the operator, the New Zealand doctrine assumes nothing. It was built by a country that could never afford the machine. A patrol goes in carrying its war on its back, plans as if no rescue is coming, and therefore avoids ever needing one. It's not romanticism. It's the rational strategy of the small. When you cannot afford to win fights, you make certain you cannot be found. In December 2001, a squadron of these soldiers joined Task Force Ghar in Afghanistan. Their first missions were pure signature discipline, special reconnaissance patrols inserted by helicopter into the high snow country, on foot, at altitude, in winter, establishing hides and watching. In time, they would run vehicle patrols of 20 to 30 days and up to 2,000 kilometers, unresupplied, across the country no one else was watching. Modified Humvees scouted by motorbikes. No rhythm, no route, no warning. The desert equivalent of the jungle hide. An enemy can pattern a base. He cannot pattern a force that lives beyond the map. When the US Navy later pinned its presidential unit citation on Task Force Ghar's units, the New Zealanders stood among the honoured. So there they were, both tribes, in the same coalition, in the same winter, sharing bases and briefings, the fastest doctrine on earth and the quietest, wearing the same flag patches of alliance. The internet imagines them arguing in a briefing room. Reality staged something crueler and more honest. Because in late February 2002, the coalition finally moved against the fortress valley of Shahi Kot. The plan was called Operation Anaconda, and the mountains were about to grade both philosophies in the same week within sight of each other's positions. Understand the physics of the arena first, because the physics drove everything. The Shahi Kot sits near 3,000 meters, its peaks higher. At that altitude, in winter air, helicopters lose lift, engines lose power, and load margins evaporate. Machines that own the sky at sea level arrive in the Hindu Kush gasping. Cold kills batteries, thickens oil, and turns wounded men into hypothermia cases within the hour. This was terrain that punished machinery and rewarded whatever could live in it unaided. The precise dividing line between the two philosophies in this story. Anaconda's plan was a hammer and anvil, conventional infantry air assaulting into the valley to block escape routes, while allied Afghan forces drove the enemy onto them. Intelligence estimated a few hundred fighters, many expected to flee. The estimate was wrong on every axis, and wrong in the worst direction. Close to 1,000 dug-in fighters held the high ground rather than the valley. They had mortars and heavy machine guns pre-ranged onto the valley floor, and they had spent months preparing to stand and fight rather than flee anywhere. The first philosophy to report for duty was the invisible one. In the days before the assault, while the enemy watched the roads and listened for helicopters, small coalition reconnaissance teams walked into the enemy's own hills and disappeared. Australian SAS patrols, American recce teams, and the New Zealanders. 3 New Zealand Special Air Service patrols operated in that reconnaissance screen, silent eyes on the fortress. And here the record hands the loud tribe a compliment the folklore always forgets. One of the most celebrated reconnaissance actions of the battle belonged to a SEAL recce element, which discovered an enemy heavy machine gun team positioned exactly where the Americans planned an observation post, and eliminated it in the battle's opening hours. SEALs could do quiet superbly. The doctrine divide was never about talent. It was about what each institution treats as its default setting. When the assault went in on the 2nd of March 2002, the plan met the mountain within hours. Infantry landing in the valley found themselves not blocking a fleeing enemy, but pinned beneath a dug-in one. Mortar rounds walking across the landing zones. The ridgelines above them alive with guns the estimates had missed. And it was then that the value of the hidden eyes became arithmetic. Soldiers pinned on the valley floor survived on fire, directed by unseen observers above. Aircraft hunting invisible mortar pits were talked onto them by men who had been watching those pits for days, logging their crew's routines, their resupply paths, their sleeping hours. An observation post is a boring photograph until a battle starts. Then it becomes the most valuable real estate in the war. The quiet philosophy was carrying the loud one's battle, exactly as it's designed to. Then came Takur Ghar, and this part of the story must be told with respect, because 7 Americans died on that mountain, and none of them died foolishly. Late on the 3rd of March, with the battle below in the balance, planners decided to place an observation post on the summit of Takur Ghar, a peak of over 3,000 meters, dominating the whole valley, the single best piece of observation ground in the arena. The position was superb. That was never the error. Pressed for time, the insertion helicopter flew a SEAL team directly to the summit landing zone. The summit was already an Al-Qaeda strongpoint. The helicopter took rocket and machine gun fire on the peak. As it lurched away, a SEAL, Petty Officer Neil Roberts, fell from the open ramp, alone, into the heart of the enemy position. What followed became one of the most harrowing nights of the modern American military, the team returning for their man, Air Force Combat Controller John Chapman, fighting to the death at close quarters. A quick reaction force of Rangers shot down on the same peak at dawn. A day-long battle in thigh-deep snow. 7 Americans were killed. 2 Medals of Honor, Chapman's and SEAL team leader Britt Slabinski's, eventually told the nation what courage on that mountain looked like. The peak was eventually taken, the wounded brought down, the dead carried home. Nobody seriously calls Takur Ghar a verdict on any single man. The men were magnificent. But military institutions, on both sides of the Pacific, drew the doctrinal lesson, because it was written at institutional scale. The direct approach, machine-delivered, speed-reliant, assumption-heavy, had been sent to do a patient disciplines job, landing on a summit that days of unseen observation would have revealed as occupied. The mountains had graded the homework of an entire way of war. In the same valley, in the same week, the patrols that moved like glaciers, Australian, American, New Zealand, remained unseen, effective, and alive. The fake quote says, "Garbage." The mountain said something subtler. Every doctrine is brilliant inside its assumptions and lethal to its own men outside them. So who won the argument? Here's the answer the folklore can't process. Both tribes conceded, and both were right to. Watch what the American Special Operations community did after 2002. Special reconnaissance came roaring back into fashion. The patient disciplines, observation, tracking, low signature movement, environmental mastery, were re-emphasized across the force, and mountain and austere environment training deepened. The nation that owned the sky had been reminded, at the cost of 7 men, that the sky is not the ground. And watch what the quiet tribes did. They kept borrowing the machine. New Zealand's later campaigns leaned gladly on American helicopters, American medevac, American air power, because the honest half of the invisible doctrine is that when patience fails and the shooting starts, nothing on earth is more welcome than the loud tribe arriving angry. There's a name for what happened to both communities in the years after: Convergence. American Special Operations rebuilt its reverence for the crawl, the recce school, the hide site, the trained tracker, while the Commonwealth regiments rebuilt their access to the sprint, integrating into American networks of aircraft, intelligence, and fire support their own nations could never field. Look at any first-rank Special Operations force today, and you'll find both doctrines living in the same soldier, switched between like languages. That synthesis was purchased, in part, on the mountains this story has described. That's the mature truth. The invented insult flattens. These two philosophies aren't rivals so much as two halves of one complete answer. And every serious special operations community since Anaconda has been trying to hold both. The SEAL who can vanish, the tracker who can call thunder. It's why the units that internet folklore insist despise each other, keep exchanging personnel and training together, decade after decade. The New Zealanders regularly train with American forces, and the respect runs through official channels in both directions, from that shared presidential unit citation to alliance arrangements that persist today. Now the ledger on the title, kept honestly as always. Did a New Zealand Special Air Service soldier ever tell Navy SEALs their tactics were garbage? No record of it exists, and this script has told you so from the first minute. The phrase belongs to the same folklore factory as every other invented special forces showdown this channel has investigated. Was there a hidden clash? Genuinely, yes. But it was hidden where real military arguments live. In doctrine manuals, in after-action reviews, in the priorities of training budgets and the design of selection courses, not shouted across a briefing room by a sergeant screenwriters invented. It was the deep, professional, career-long argument between speed and silence, signature and firepower, the machine and the man, argued not with insults but with operations, and refereed by the most impartial judge on earth, terrain that kills the wrong answer. And if you want a single image to keep from all of this, take the valley itself in the first week of March 2002. On the floor, American infantry fighting for their lives with a courage no doctrine gets credit for. Above them, on one peak, the loud philosophy paying in full for an assumption and producing 2 medals of honor in the paying. And scattered invisible across the other ridgelines, the patient philosophy at work. Australian, American and New Zealand. Patrols nobody ever saw, quietly directing the battle below, their greatest achievement being the absence of any story to tell about them. Loud and invisible, on the same freezing mountains, in the same brutal week, bleeding for the same cause. Neither tactic was garbage, neither ever was. The garbage was the assumption, and the mountain collected it. Elite units don't trade insults. They trade lessons, and they pay tuition in life. That's the real hidden clash between the Navy SEALs and the New Zealand Special Air Service. Not a shouting match in a briefing room, but a 20-year conversation conducted in doctrine revisions, joint exercises, and quiet professional watching. And the reason both are better and both are humbler is that the other exists. Who dares wins, says one regiment's motto. The only easy day was yesterday, answers the other tribes. The Hindu Kush in March 2002 endorsed them both and footnoted each with the same cold warning. Only inside your assumptions, check them first. The mountain will.